Hello everyone and welcome back to my workshop for another of my Jeti training videos. You've caught me in the midst of building the Kerry Sterner 1/5 scale vampire, and so that's going to keep me occupied for a good year or more yet. But anyway, what we're going to be dealing with today, of course, is your Jeti radio system. And what we're going to do is have a look at troubleshooting. What to do when you run up against some of the things that don't work the way you expected them to work. And I've based this on questions that have come up on internet forums and Facebook groups and direct questions to me from the last few years. Now, I will put in chapters into YouTube, so if you bring up the timeline along the bottom of the screen by hovering your mouse there or whatever, you will see it is split into sections and each of them has a little title, so if you click on that you can go direct to the section you think is relevant to the problem you're having. Also, if you look in the description box, you'll find that they are highlighted there, and so that should help you find the bit you're looking for. But please do have a watch through, because you never know what you'll pick up this first run through the whole thing.
Another way to find out what you're having a problem with is check if it's already been answered. Obviously, I'm going to promote my own video channel here. There may be some others on YouTube, but if you follow the videos there, it will list all the videos. That's rather a lot. But if you press playlists, you'll see that I have sorted the vast majority of my videos, not all of them, into relevant playlists. For instance, there's Jeti Helicopter, Jeti Lua apps, Jeti for gliders, and so on. So there's lots of topics there, and some of them have a great many videos in them dealing with all sorts of advanced programming setups and training about them. Or you could do what I do when I need to find one of my own videos, and that is use the search. And all of my Jeti videos start with Jeti space hyphen space and then the relevant name. So I search for it by Jeti space and then 1, 2 or 3 keywords for what I'm after. For instance, I'm going to search for the complete setup of a glider. So I could search just by glider. Let's see what that comes up with. And there we are. Just from those 2 words, we found the complete setup for a glider. So just type in Jeti and then 1, 2 or 3 keywords, and the good chance is that it will come up with the relevant video.
And now a shameless request for your help in making these videos. As you know, I'm a great fan of a proper Italian espresso and a chocolate biscuit to give you caffeine and sugar for your brain to use when programming your radio. But my videos can take quite a lot of work. For example, the Tomcat video took 4 days almost from unpacking the model to packing it away, making all the films, retakes, doing all the editing, getting it right for you. And that means I get through a lot of espresso and a lot of chocolate biscuits. And you can help me with that. And chocolate biscuits, and that is to make a donation through the YouTube Super Thanks. Along the bottom of the video there will be a super thanks, or perhaps it's in the more section if you press the little 3 dots, and that allows you to make a direct contribution. You have to be signed in to YouTube, by the way, in order for that to appear. And if you do that, you get to make a highlighted comment in the comments section of the video, and your help in keeping me supplied with espresso and chocolate biscuits would be very much appreciated.
Here is one of the interesting things you can discover if you read the instruction manual. There is an emergency switch-off procedure. As it says here in section 6.2, in case of an emergency, a fast turn-off can be achieved by simultaneously pressing and holding the power and the ESC buttons, but never use this during normal working conditions. A little bit further down in section 6.3, transmitter restart, number 1, use the standard switch it off and switch it back on with the main power button. But Number 2, if necessary, use the emergency switch off by simultaneously pressing and holding the power and ESC buttons. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate it because, as it says, never use this during normal working conditions. I have had to use it once. The very first DS16 I had developed a fault in the memory card and would not switch off, but thankfully I remembered reading something about an emergency turn-off procedure in the manual, so I dug it out, found this, followed it, and that switched it off. So there are very rare occasions when you might need to do this. Maybe once a year, yeah, it's only about that. Somebody on an internet forum or Facebook group asks because they can't get the transmitter to switch off and they're getting really worried about it. So there you are. There is the procedure to use. Okay, so you've bought some second-hand Jeti equipment. Might be the transmitter, might be receivers, central boxes, sensors, whatever. First thing you want to do is set them all back to the factory default and then connect them up to Studio and do updates. There isn't a reset to factory default for the transmitter, but there is for receivers and central boxes. So go into Model, Device Explorer, and somewhere in its menu you will find a Reset to Factory Defaults. And that's very important because the question comes up from time to time, somebody's bought a receiver or whatever, and it's doing weird things. And that's because what they often forget to mention is they've bought this second hand, and the previous owner has done things like remap channels to the outputs, so that channel 2 is coming out of output 10, for instance. They've had valid reasons to do it. So clear out everything the previous owner has done. In the transmitter, sadly, there is no option to reset to the factory default. So what I suggest you do is watch my video, Newcomer to Jeti, which takes you through a lot of what you need set in the system settings configuration, just to make sure there, because again, previous owners may have done weird things. Okay, you're having problems binding a receiver. You've gone into the transmitter, into the wireless modes, you've selected pair the primary module, and you've set it off. So the little egg timer there is waiting for the receiver. You've put the bind plug into the receiver, you've powered up the receiver, and it just sits there saying pair primary module. What you need to do is press the programming dial again. There we are. Okay, now you've done that, and it's still not seeing the receiver. Sometimes, I'll clear that out. Sometimes it can be a fault with this, the bind plug. It is pretty rare, but it still surprises me that they can be faulty, because it's very simply a bit of wire between the two outside pins to short them. And I have had this myself. It's very frustrating until you realize what's going on. Just get another bind plug and pop that in. Sometimes people run into a problem trying to do an update. Jeti used to do updates by providing you with a file on their website which you would upload to the device. And some people are still trying to do it that way. Please don't. Jeti stopped supporting that method quite a while ago. They do everything through Jeti Studio. So just get yourself Studio and do it that way. Other problems you can run into is when trying to update a central box or one of the Meson speed controllers. They do have to have power supplied to them, unlike receivers and sensors, which don't need any power supplied to them. They just need hooking up to the USB lead. So connect up a power to your central box, and with a Meson, yes, you're going to have to power it with the big drive battery. So just make sure that the 3 output leads to the motor from your Meson cannot possibly touch one another, just in case any current leaks that way. If you're wondering what firmware version you have got on your transmitter or receivers or devices, rather than have to go and hook everything up to Jeti Studio to find out if it's up to date, you can find them. In the transmitter, you can find its firmware version by going to System, Information, and it tells you there It's version 5.07 I've got on it. Backup for your 900. Okay, there. What about receivers and devices? Well, go into the model, device explorer, into your receiver, and somewhere in here there will be the firmware version that's installed on this device. It's in Tools. There we go. So it's down here. So this receiver is running firmware version 3.26 from that date. Right, the servo is not moving. Everything's powered up. The transmitter says the receiver's bound and they're connected. A and Q's are lovely, but the servo just won't move. First things, check servo monitor. Just go into the menu, press servo monitor, and move the relevant stick. Is that servo output moving? That means the transmitter at least is sending that signal to the receiver. So if the servo's not moving, it's something's gone wrong somewhere in the link. If the servo monitor shows it's not moving, you're wiggling the stick and nothing's happening, there's something wrong in your programming of the transmitter. Have you got the throttle lock on? Have you mixed it to 0, by going to minus 100%? Have you set in a flat curve somewhere? If the transmitter says it's moving that channel, but nothing's happening in the receiver, perhaps it's been remapped in the receiver. You go into Model, Device Explorer, into the receiver, Receiver Outputs. This is where you can remap the channels to the output pin. It will default to, as it shows here, channel 1 throttle is at output pin number 1. Channel 2, out pin 2, channel 3. But you can change those. And if you've done it in the past, or you've bought a second-hand item where the previous owner has remapped the outputs, it could be trying to output your channel 2 at pin 10. So then your servo is not plugged in there, which is why nothing's happening. So the big thing, reset the factory defaults or check your servo mapping here. What else could happen? It's very unlikely to happen with a speed controller or some other electronic device like Jetronic air valves, etc. But try just reversing that servo just to see if it works. Because Jeti tends to travel in the same direction from, for instance, idle to full power. It has the same servo direction as those reasonable, I wouldn't say it's an industry standard, but most channels and most speed controllers work that way. But you never know, somebody might have designed their speed controller to work the other way around and it's getting confused between what it thinks is high and low throttle and it won't arm. So try just reversing it just to see. And if your speed controller or your jet engine ECU or whatever seems unhappy, just make sure in servo monitor that your throttle is going from minus 100% with the stick back to plus 100% with the stick forward at full throttle. A JR, if you looked at the output of those same sort of values, would be doing, in comparison to Jeti, JR would be going from minus 80 up to plus 80. So if you're doing the minus 100 to plus 100, you're certainly not short of the range of things. And speed controllers and electronic devices ought to be happy. The other thing is, if it's still not responding, especially where it's not a servo but some electronic device like a Jeti ECU, speed controller, valves, electronic valves, is the output period you're using. Come to this, general settings, here, your output period. My advice is never use auto. Auto will pass on the transmission rate between the transmitter and receiver, which, except in a very special circumstance, you should have at 100 Hertz, which is 10 milliseconds. And of course, that is quite fast for the old-fashioned analog devices. It may damage servos and some electronics things. Certain jet engine ECUs particularly just don't like going that fast. The other thing is that auto, it doesn't run at an absolutely fixed 10 milliseconds. Due to frame losses, it can jitter up and down a little bit, and some devices, particularly a certain brand of jet engine ECU, just does not like that. It would be happy with a fixed 10 milliseconds, but it doesn't like the jitter in auto. So my recommendation is never use auto, always choose a specific value. Something around 20 milliseconds for good old analog servos, analog devices. Faster if you can use all digital stuff and they are happy with the faster speed. Let's take a look at a few of the typical issues that come up with an assist. And for this I've got the help of my lovely little hawker demon. So let's go here and connect up the battery.
Warning. Motor battery not charged. Initialized. Armed.
Warnings. And because it's an assist, we got there the voice output initialized, armed. And what can often happen is that all you hear is initialized. It does not say armed. And so a while ago I asked Jeti by email, and they replied that if it has said initialized and then the servos respond to the controls, it is armed. The reason that sometimes it does not say armed is that the voice file to say armed is back in the queue of other things to be done and spoken, and it just gets dropped out of the queue preceded by other things, and so it doesn't see it. So if the transmitter has said initialized and then the servos work, it's armed and it's okay to go. But of course it would always be worth a quick test, wiggle the model, make sure it is going. Another problem that crops up frequently is that people go to their assist when they're setting it up, and they're setting up the different mode switches, the on-off switch, the gain knob, etc. And they go here and they try to set their assist mode switch, their gain tuning channels, the assist off switch, and they're wiggling the switches and swinging the knobs and nothing's happening. Well, when that sort of thing happens, as we've said before, if servos and devices don't respond, have a look in servo monitor, because that will give you the first clue when you're rotating the gain knob or moving the switches that nothing in servo monitor is moving. And the reason is you forgot to create a function and or forgot to assign servos to it. So if you go and create your functions, gains, gyro, on-off switch, gyro mode switches, and of course, very importantly, assign your servos to it, then when you look in servo monitor, as you move switches,
Gyro off. Gyro on.
things work, and so then the assist will pick them up. Now let's have a look at some of the things that might stump you regarding sounds and telemetry and alarms that don't seem to make sense. For instance, here we've got obviously there's an alarm going off about receiver voltage, but it's not telling us anything, which it should be. It should be giving out the audio. And we can see that we've got the MUI, 75 voltage, it's all plugged in, but there's no data there. Surprising amount is hidden in this tools button. From the main menu, press that, up comes the menu. And we can see that the volume, the master volume, is turned off. I happen to have it assigned to the P7 knob. If it wasn't, you could just come down here to highlight it and turn it up with the dial. So if I turn it up,
Warning. Low voltage.
there we are.
Warning. Low voltage.
I'll turn it back down again just to silence that for a moment. And sometimes the question comes up, now, why am I not getting telemetry? I go into sensors and loggings, the items are there, but there's no data. And as we can see on the screen here, there's just no data. Back into the tools, And there's a master switch here for telemetry. If it's switched off, turn it on. And lo and behold, we've got data. It's a strange place to have had it, rather than in the sensors and logging menu, but there it is. Next thing that stumps people is, why am I getting this voltage alarm? If I go into the timers and sensors, alarms, see, the voltage alarm for the receiver is set to go off if it's below 4.5 volts. But we can see it's 6.39 volts. Why am I getting a voltage alarm? It's because there are actually two places where a voltage alarm is generated. If you use timer sensors, alarms, the alarm is generated in the transmitter. What it does is it looks at the value that's coming in on telemetry, which in this case 6.39 volts, compares it to the alarm there and says, do I need to alarm? No, I will not alarm. Fine. But there is also an alarm generator in the receiver itself. In this case, in the advanced properties, oh, easier to get to if it's not an assist. There we are, the low voltage alarm. See that? Alarm settings. What this does is the receiver also tests the voltage it's getting, which was reporting as 6.39 volts, against the value set in there. And if that's obviously higher than the voltage it's getting, it independently generates an alarm condition and sends that down telemetry to the transmitter, which then is broadcasting it. Generally, this defaults to some nice lowish value. Let's reset it to the factory defaults and we'll see. Changes. Yep. Right, advanced properties. There's the default value, 4.5 volts. So the receiver is now comparing the voltage, 6.39, against the alarm setting, 4.5, and says, I don't need to send the alarm condition anymore. And the alarm has stopped. Now, you might also get an alarm that just comes up with a letter code, which may or may
Warning,
not
low voltage.
be accompanied by a voice output. You might just get the red banner saying alarm and then a letter code. And this is a
Warning, low voltage.
Morse code alarm, and it's generated in the telemetry sensor. In this case, the MUI 75 is generating it.
Warning, low voltage.
So why is it generating it, and how do we stop it, and how do we interpret it, and what do we do about it? Well, first of all, we want to get
Warning, low voltage.
rid of it. It's a legacy item. We'll talk about that in a moment. So first of all, go to timer sensors,
Warning, low voltage.
alarms, and switch off the Morse code alarms. Switch them off. That will shut it up. See, we're not getting the alarm anymore. The system defaults to the Morse code alarms are not enabled. But if you've been trawling through things and out of curiosity enabled them and nothing happened, because you didn't have the receiver and an old-fashioned telemetry sensor plugged in, you'd think, well, fine. Or if you've bought second-hand and the previous owner had Morse code alarms enabled, you'd be thinking, what on earth is going on here? Okay, let's go and have a look at the sensor and how and why it was generating it, and we can disable it there as well, just to be absolutely sure. Oh, by the way, if we pop back into it, timer sensors, no, silly me, alarms, we'll re-enable it.
Warning, low voltage.
I'll turn the volume down, sorry, so we can go and have a look. It was Morse code alarm U. Now in Britain, English we use V for volts, but the continentals, where this is made, use the letter U. Hence an MUI is M for Jeti sensor, then the UI is volts and amps. Why not V and A? Well, I for current, U for whatever it is. You can scroll down here and see that U, Morse code U, is being associated with the low U, low volts, voice file. So that's why that was speaking out. If there isn't a voice file associated with it, then all you would get is the red banner. So for instance, you might get alarm E coming up, but no voice output. That's because that's there, nothing in it. We'll switch it off again, get rid of that. And if we go to Applications, Jeti box, into there, come across, down. Is it across again or down? I can never remember. Down. Okay, so we don't want the actual values, so we can press the right hand button. We don't want them in max. We don't want the settings. We want alarms. Lovely. Come down into alarms, and there we are. The voltage alarm has been set at 2.3 volts. And you can press left or right buttons to set the voltage at which the alarm will sound off. So if we press left button, voltage alarm off. So the sensor itself will stop creating that Morse code alarm. Now we come down again, you can see current alarm is off, capacity alarm is off, and that's it. That's the 3 alarms available to be set up in the sensor device itself. And the reason for that goes back to the days before Jeti made transmitters. They made transmitter modules that you'd plug into your JR or Futaba. But of course that couldn't be run by the transmitter software. All the transmitter did was pass the PPM signal to it, and it sent it off as 2.4 gig. And it could get telemetry back from the system, but it couldn't do anything much with it. So it would just beep out the Morse code alarm, and therefore they all had to be created in the telemetry sensors, sent back by the receiver, which again is why the receiver has a voltage alarm in it. And so that if you're still using your old transmitter with a Jeti module in the back as the transmission module, and some people still are, it will still work with all the modern equipment. And finally, something that comes up is that the telemetry has not been logged. So people want to go to Data Analyzer or download the files to Jeti Studio and have a look at things, and it's not there. The file's not there. Well, there are 2 possibilities here. First of all, it simply wasn't created in the first place. And secondly, that it was created, but it's got the wrong file name because your date and time in the transmitter are wrong. So if we have a look in timer sensors, into sensors logging setup, is it switched on to be logged? There, you can turn it off. So if the logging of an individual item was switched off, it's not going to be recorded. Now, it could be that logging itself, i.e. recording, just never switched on because it's been disabled perhaps, or you've changed the switch. And so to get to that, you'd think it would be in timer sensors. No, it's in advanced properties, in the other model options here. What switch starts it logging the data? Because it won't simply log the data when you switch the transmitter or receiver on. It needs to have something that then kicks it off. You've got this square at the moment, which will turn to a solid circle when logging is happening. And the start logging switch, for me generally, is the auto. Basically, once you start a timer running, logging will start. That turns into a nice blue, well in this case, colored disc anyway. And so if you've changed this, or you haven't started a timer, then there's no logging happening. It used to frustrate me a bit that when I went slope soaring, I would forget to start the timer at launch, and therefore the whole flight was not logged. So I tried to build in some little automatic switches to force it to do it. But something needs to happen. So if you don't always start a timer at the start of a flight, consider some other logging switch for this model that will kick off the logging. And the other problem that happens is that if we come out of here, it has done everything. So you've got logging switched on. The individual items say yes, they should be logged, but it's not there. And the most common reason for that, in fact the only reason for that I've ever come across, is that the date and time, particularly the date in the transmitter, is wrong. Because when you stop logging, it creates the file, gives it a name, and the name was the date and time that the log started. And it gets that date and time from the transmitter settings. So you go to System, Configuration, look down here, Date and Time. And what you will find there is that you've got the wrong date in it. And before you go changing it to the correct date, make a note of what date and time it's at, because that's going to be the name of the log file you are looking for. So now at least you know you can find that log file if you go into Data Analyzer, or if you're looking for it in Jeti Studio. And then change it to the correct date and time, and now your log files will be correctly named. You've come to Jeti Studio and you're going to have a look at the telemetry from a model which has a central box. You call up any item of telemetry, in this case the voltage, and notice what are these warning triangles. And they tell you that your central box has had an RX2 timeout. It might be an RX1 timeout, I just happen to have been playing with the RX2 to cause this. You think, what on earth is that? RX2. Let's have a look at the Q value. I'll get rid of this voltage for the moment. RX2 Q. That's strange. Look along here, the Q is flatlined at 100%. Why am I getting an RX2 timeout warning from the central box? Let's take a look at its A values. Well, they're flatlined at 9 as well. It happens to be on the workbench, so it's perfect. Aerial strength's 9 on both, 100% data quality. But the central box is saying that receiver 2, and this is genuinely receiver 2, has timed out. What's going on? Let's go and have a look at what Data Analyzer on the transmitter looks like. And so you've come to have a look at it on Data Analyzer, or perhaps you're at the airfield and you're just looking at your model in Data Analyzer. You've called up any telemetry item, and there is this worrying message. Central box, RX 1 or 2, timeout. But the Q's and A's are 100% or very, very good. What's going on? Let's go back to here. The antenna values. That's telling you the communication between the transmitter and the receiver. Now, I've got a central box here. I'm using Jeti RSAT2s. And these A and Q values are between the transmitter and the RSAT, or the REX3 or the REX12, whatever you're using. Nothing to do with the central box. The only point where the central box has got involved in this is providing power to it. So if, for instance, I was to disconnect that, then obviously your A and Q values for that receiver would drop to 0 because it's got no power. So how can the central box be telling me that RX2, which is socket 2, or RX1, which would be socket number 1, on the central box, has timed out? What does it mean? It means it has had no signal for more than 2 seconds. So if it gets no signal for under 2 seconds, it won't do the timeout alarm. This is what Jeti tells me anyway. And if it's had no signal for more than 2 seconds, it will say timeout. If the timeout alarm is enabled, we'll have a look in a second. So how can the A and Q values be fine, but the central box is saying, I've had no data? Well, have a think about it. The clue there is a wire, a cable, between your receiver and the central box. So I have made a very special cable here where I can just remove, you can see it out fuzzy at the side, the data pin.
Warning.
There we are. What we're getting here is the central box saying, I'm not getting any data on RX2. But these A and Q values are good because they're between the transmitter and the receiver. The central box is now saying, yeah, that might be working fine, but I am not getting the data. And there we are. It's a dodgy cable. I only use the cables that either come with Jeti or I make up my own using power box wire and power box plugs and sockets. If you have another brand you're happy with the reliability, that's fine. And let's have a look in the CB at some of the settings and some of the data that's there. Now down here, receiver inputs. This is not something you can set, it's just information. See, the menu jumps over it. And it tells you R1, that's the R1 socket up here, and R2, that's the R2 socket up here, are receiving X bus. They are auto-sensing, so if you provide it with PPM, for instance, they will say PPM. But obviously we like to use X bus. Watch what happens to R2 a few seconds after I pull the data pin out of R2.
Warning.
See, it's recognized it's not getting data anymore. I'll push the pin back in and it will recognize it's getting data and that it's X bus. So it's quite happy. Now, come down to RX alarm. You can enable or disable it. If it's disabled, you will not get that warning message coming up, nor will it be logged either. I think it'd be nice for it to be logged, even if you've disabled the warning coming up on screen. So we've disabled it. We pull the pin out. We're no longer going to be told that it's happened. Okay. So push that pin back in. And there is actually a little bit more data available to us. Let's go to the telemetry min-max. I'll clear it out so it sets everything back to starting again now, and look at statistics. It's telling you these two ports, not the actual receivers, because this is central box data. So the RX1 and RX2 or R1, R2 ports tells you what's happening there. And look at them, they're counting up in real time since I just did that reset. So they're happily going along. They've, for 100% of the time, they have been getting data. So I shall pull the pin out and watch the RX2 time stops counting up, and therefore its percentage goes down. Because for the time it's been up, it's not collecting data there. Put it back in and you'll see it start counting, and its percentage will very slowly rise now. So there is quite a bit of data available to you, and it carries on. This data is available with the warning not enabled or disabled. And it will continue this over many sessions of the central box being switched on and off until you do the clear now bit. But there is another circumstance in which you can get that warning, and but it will be accompanied by the A and Q values going to 0, and that is of course a genuine loss of data because you've lost connection with that receiver. So if we go into Advanced Properties, Wireless Modes Trainer, and we'll disable the primary module in this case. Say OK to that. Come back here.
Warning.
And there you can see the A and Q values have gone to 0, and it's warning us that RX1 is timing out because it's had more than 2 seconds without data. So this is a timeout warning that it's kind of nice to have, because if RX1's timed out, of course the central box is going to switch over to RX2, and you think, thank goodness I had a double path 2 receiver system. Let's put it back on again.
Warning.
But that is accompanied by A and Q values going to 0.
Warning.
So if you've got A and Q values are good, but you get the RX timeout, it's a dodgy cable. If your A and Qs have gone to 0 and you get a timeout warning, it's because they've simply lost the connection, and thank goodness for double path.